It was a humid evening in the small town of Everglade Bay, Florida. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet streets. People here knew each other by name, and the pace of life was slow. At the heart of the town was the Everglade Bay Church, a place where many gathered for worship, seeking solace in their faith. The church was led by Reverend Thomas Whitaker, a well-respected man of God known for his kindness, his generosity, and his unwavering faith. But on this particular evening, a tragedy unfolded that would shake the small community to its core. Reverend Whitaker's wife, Claire Whitaker, had always been the picture of grace and beauty. A nurse by profession, Claire was admired not only for her looks, but for her gentle nature. She had met Thomas when she was still a young woman, and they had married shortly after meeting in a whirlwind romance. Together, they had built a life rooted in love, faith, and the promise of family. However, for years, Claire and Thomas had tried to have children with no success. The couple's dream of starting a family together had been a constant source of strain on their relationship. Claire, in particular, was desperate to have children, and the longing in her heart grew with each passing year. Yet, no matter how many doctors they saw or treatments they tried, the pregnancy tests remained negative. But Claire, ever the optimist, clung to the hope that one day they would have the family they so dearly wanted. What Claire didn't know was that her husband, Reverend Thomas Whitaker, had a secret that had been buried for years, one that would ultimately lead to a deadly confrontation. Reverend Whitaker had undergone a vasectomy in his early 30s, before he had even met Claire. He hadn't shared this information with her, convinced that the decision to never have children was a personal one and not something that needed to be discussed. In his mind, it was a choice he had made long before he met her, and it wasn't a decision he was willing to revisit. As years went by, he silently struggled with the guilt of not being able to give Claire the children she so desperately wanted, but he kept his secret close, hoping she would never find out. But Claire had begun to suspect something. She noticed the subtle, unexplained tension between them when the topic of children came up, the uncomfortable silences, the way Thomas would quickly change the subject whenever she brought up their failed attempts at starting a family. For Claire, the desire to have children was more than just a wish. It was an obsession, a need that grew more intense with each passing year. On the evening of the tragedy, Claire made a decision that would forever alter the course of her life. She had found a way to finally uncover the truth, and the truth would drive her to commit an act she could never take back. That night after a church gathering, Claire and Thomas returned home. They sat down to dinner in their cozy, well-kept home, the familiar sounds of their quiet lives filling the space. But something was different. Claire's demeanor was cold, her eyes steely with determination. Thomas, ever the gentle man, noticed the change but didn't say anything. He assumed it was just another one of those fleeting moods Claire sometimes had. He had no idea that tonight would be the night that would change everything. After dinner, Claire asked Thomas to sit with her in the living room. The room, bathed in the soft glow of a lamp, seemed peaceful at first, but beneath the surface, tension thickened the air. Claire's voice was calm, almost too calm, as she asked her husband a simple question that had been haunting her for years. "Thomas, did you have a vasectomy?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Thomas froze, his face paling. He could feel the sweat begin to form on his brow, his heart racing. He knew the moment had come, the moment Claire would uncover his secret. He stammered, unable to speak at first, then finally managed to say, I didn't think it was important." "Important?" Claire's voice was rising now, her emotions boiling to the surface. "Do you know how many years I've spent wondering why we couldn't have children? I've been through so many doctors, so many tests, and all this time, you've known the truth. Why didn't you tell me, Thomas?" Her words hit him like a slap, and Thomas found himself backing away, almost physically recoiling from the accusation in her voice. He had never meant to hurt her, but now the truth was out, and he saw the depth of her pain and frustration. "I didn't think you'd understand," Thomas said, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't think it mattered after all these years." But Claire wasn't listening anymore. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind clouded with rage and heartbreak. All the years of hope, the unspoken longing for a family, had been built on a lie. And the realization of that lie cut her deeper than anything she had ever experienced. In a fit of fury, Claire stood up suddenly, her hands shaking. Without thinking, she reached for the kitchen knife that had been left on the counter earlier, its blade gleaming in the dim light. She didn't plan to kill him, not exactly. But in that moment, she felt consumed by a burning rage that clouded all reason. Thomas tried to calm her, but it was too late. In one swift motion, Claire plunged the knife into his chest. The look on his face as he collapsed onto the floor was one of shock and disbelief, but it was also one of profound sadness. Thomas had never imagined his life would end like this, at the hands of the woman he loved. As Thomas bled out on the floor, Claire stood there, her breath heavy and rapid, the weight of what she had just done crashing down on her. For a moment she stood frozen, unable to comprehend the magnitude of her actions. But when she heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance, she knew there was no turning back. The quiet town of Everglade Bay would never be the same again. Claire's tragic decision would soon set off a series of events that no one could have predicted. The truth about her husband's secret would slowly come to light, and a seasoned investigator would soon uncover everything: the lies, the deceit, and the heartbreaking tragedy that led to murder. The first responders arrived at the Whitaker household just after 9:30 p.m. Claire, still standing over her husband's lifeless body, had dialed 911 herself, though her voice was barely audible, muffled by shock and disbelief. When the officers arrived, they found her kneeling beside Thomas, her hands stained with his blood, her face a mask of terror. The scene was gruesome, but there was no immediate sign of struggle. Thomas's body lay crumpled on the floor, a pool of blood quickly spreading beneath him, staining the beige carpet. The kitchen knife was still embedded in his chest, the gleaming blade catching the light from the overhead lamp. Claire was shaking uncontrollably, her breath ragged, as she kept repeating the same words over and over. "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to." The paramedics did their best, but there was nothing they could do. Thomas Whitaker was pronounced dead at the scene. Detective Sarah McAllister, a seasoned investigator with the Everglade Bay Police Department, arrived shortly after the paramedics. She had seen her fair share of crime scenes, but there was something about this one that felt different. Everglade Bay was a quiet town with very little crime. Murders were almost unheard of here. Most people in the community had known Thomas and Claire for years. The idea that a man of faith, a respected preacher in the town, could be killed in his own home was unthinkable. As McAllister entered the house, she took in the scene with a professional's eye, noting the absence of forced entry, the lack of any obvious signs of struggle, and the way Claire was positioned beside her husband's body. Her first instinct told her this wasn't a random act of violence. The circumstances felt personal. But what could have driven Claire, the gentle and devoted wife, to murder her husband? McAllister approached Claire carefully, her expression one of empathy and patience. She had dealt with her fair share of distressed individuals, but there was something about Claire's demeanor that didn't sit right. Claire was frantic, yes, but there was also a sense of coldness in her eyes, a hollowness that McAllister couldn't quite explain. "Claire," McAllister said softly, kneeling down beside her, "can you tell me what happened?" Claire's face contorted as she wiped away her tears, but she didn't seem to make much eye contact. She glanced at her husband's body, her lips trembling. He wasn't the man I thought he was. I couldn't take it anymore, Detective. I just couldn't." McAllister's brow furrowed as she absorbed Claire's words. She had expected the typical shocked and confused reactions, the disbelief that often accompanies violent crime, especially in a small town like this. But Claire's response was strangely detached, almost like someone trying to justify their actions. "Can you tell me what you mean, Claire?" McAllister pressed, maintaining a calm tone. Claire's hands trembled as she wiped them on her blouse. She looked away from McAllister, staring at nothing in particular. Thomas had a secret, a big one, a secret that he never told me. "I've been trying to have a child for years, Detective, and every doctor said the same thing. I'm healthy, I'm fine, but I never knew why. I thought maybe it was me. But now I know." Her voice trailed off, and McAllister waited, her eyes narrowing as she watched Claire carefully. There was something about Claire's tone that suggested she was still working through the emotions of the moment, but McAllister knew better than to rush her. Claire continued, her voice barely above a whisper. He had a vasectomy before we even met. He didn't want children. He never told me. He let me go on believing it was my fault. All these years, it was a lie. A vasectomy. McAllister's mind clicked into gear. This was new information. But why would Claire murder her husband over something like that? A misunderstanding? A betrayal? Yes, but murder? McAllister's gut told her that there was more to this than Claire was letting on. "Where is the knife now?" McAllister asked, trying to keep her voice steady. I I don't know, Claire replied, glancing around the room, her eyes darting nervously. "I didn't mean to hurt him. I just wanted answers. When he didn't say anything, I don't know." McAllister followed Claire's gaze and spotted the knife on the kitchen counter, just a few feet away. She noted how the blade gleamed in the dim light, still stained with Thomas's blood. It wasn't unusual for a murder weapon to be left at the scene, but McAllister had a feeling that the situation was more complicated than it appeared. "Claire, I'm going to need to ask you some questions," McAllister said, her voice firm but calm. "I'm going to need you to tell me everything. We'll get to the bottom of this, but I need you to be honest with me. Can you do that?" Claire nodded, her lips trembling. McAllister stood up and looked around the room. She could see the framed pictures on the mantel of the couple in happier times. Vacations, anniversaries, and family gatherings. They had appeared to be the perfect couple, the perfect family. But behind that facade was a web of lies, and McAllister knew the truth would eventually come out. The investigation into the murder of Reverend Thomas Whitaker would be complex. There were many questions to be answered. Why had Claire waited so long to act? Why hadn't Thomas shared the truth with her? Was this an impulsive crime of passion, or was there more beneath the surface? As McAllister began to gather evidence from the scene, she could feel the weight of the investigation pressing down on her. But one thing was clear. Claire Whitaker wasn't just a victim of her husband's secret. She was also the prime suspect in his murder. The following morning, the town of Everglade Bay was abuzz with whispers. News of the tragic murder had spread quickly through the small community, sending shockwaves through the tight-knit group of residents. Reverend Thomas Whitaker, the beloved preacher who had counseled, prayed with, and served the town for over a decade, was dead. His wife, Claire, had been arrested in connection with his murder. The questions were endless, and answers seemed elusive. Detective Sarah McAllister spent the entire morning at the Whitaker household, carefully sifting through evidence and gathering statements. Claire had been taken to the station for further questioning, but McAllister knew that the key to unlocking the mystery was going to lie not just in what Claire said, but in what she left unsaid. The house was eerily quiet now. The once warm, inviting space felt cold and empty without Thomas's presence. McAllister walked through the living room, scanning the area, but she kept coming back to one thing: the kitchen knife. It was so ordinary, so unremarkable, yet it had played such a crucial role in the tragedy. The knife was covered in Thomas's blood, but there were no signs of a struggle between him and Claire. The absence of defensive wounds or any indication that Thomas had tried to fight back made it seem as though he hadn't expected the attack at all. Why would Claire, a woman who had been married to Thomas for years, suddenly lash out in such a violent way? McAllister made a mental note to investigate Thomas's medical records, to look deeper into his past, and, most importantly, to speak with anyone who might have seen something that could shed light on the days leading up to the murder. She needed to know how the events unfolded, and, more importantly, what Claire had been hiding. Later that afternoon, Claire sat in an interrogation room at the Everglade Bay Police Department. She had been silent for the most part since her arrest. Her eyes were red, her face pale. The shock had not worn off. In fact, it seemed to have settled deep into her bones, immobilizing her, preventing her from fully grasping the consequences of what she had done. Claire's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, guilt, and confusion. She had never meant for this to happen. She hadn't even meant to hurt Thomas, but in that moment, when the truth came crashing down on her, she had lost control. Detective McAllister entered the room, closing the door softly behind her. Claire looked up, her eyes wide but empty. McAllister took a seat across from her and studied her carefully. There was a look of desperation in Claire's gaze, like someone who was slowly realizing that there was no way out. "Claire, I know this is difficult," McAllister said gently, "but I need you to walk me through everything. The more we know, the sooner we can make sense of what happened." Claire nodded slowly, her hands resting on the table, trembling slightly. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I never wanted to hurt him," Claire began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I loved him so much, Sarah. He was my whole world. But after all these years, all these failed attempts to have children, I I just couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't keep living a lie." McAllister remained silent, letting Claire speak, knowing that often, when people were allowed to voice their feelings, they unknowingly revealed key details. "Claire, you said that Thomas had a secret. You mentioned the vasectomy. When did you find out?" McAllister asked, her voice measured but sharp with intent. Claire's eyes dropped to her hands as she folded them together. She hesitated before answering, clearly still struggling with the emotions that churned within her. "I found out a few weeks ago," Claire said, her voice thick with emotion. "It wasn't planned. It was... it was an accident." McAllister leaned in slightly. "An accident? What do you mean by that?" "I was cleaning out some drawers in our bedroom," Claire began, her eyes glassy as she recalled the moment. "I was looking for some old papers, and I came across a letter. It was from a doctor. It said that Thomas had a vasectomy. I... I couldn't believe it. I thought it was a mistake, but then I found more papers. Medical records. Prescriptions. It was all there, Sarah. Everything. The proof. I was so angry, so confused. I confronted him right then, but he just stood there, refusing to answer. He wouldn't even look at me." Claire's voice began to crack as she continued. "I felt so betrayed. All these years, all that heartache, all the disappointment. And he had known all along. He knew I wanted a family. He knew how much it meant to me. And yet he let me go on, believing that I was the problem, that something was wrong with me." McAllister's gaze softened. She could hear the pain in Claire's words, but there was also something unsettling in the way Claire described her emotions. It wasn't just betrayal she was describing. It was an obsessive, all-consuming rage. "What happened after you confronted him?" McAllister asked. "He denied it at first," Claire said, shaking her head. "He said it didn't matter anymore. He said we were happy, and I should just accept it. But I couldn't. I felt so empty. It was like everything we had built together. All these years, it was a lie. And I couldn't live with that anymore. I couldn't live with the idea that I was married to a man who didn't want children, who didn't care enough about me to tell me the truth." Claire's voice lowered, almost to a whisper. "That night, when he came home from the church, I was still so angry. I confronted him again, and he still wouldn't tell me the truth. He just kept avoiding it, acting like everything was fine. And that's when it happened. I couldn't control myself. I just snapped." McAllister sat back in her chair, processing everything Claire had just said. It was clear that Claire was in emotional turmoil, but there was still something missing from her story. Something felt off. McAllister wasn't sure yet what it was, but she had a gut feeling that there was more to this than just a woman driven to rage by betrayal. "Claire," McAllister said after a pause, "I understand how devastating this must be for you, but I need you to be honest with me. Was there anyone else who knew about the vasectomy? Did Thomas ever confide in anyone about it?" Claire's eyes darted toward the floor, her lips trembling. She stayed silent for a long moment, her hands tightly gripping the edge of the table. McAllister could see the wheels turning in Claire's mind. But what was she hiding? Finally, Claire spoke, her voice barely audible. "There was one person, but I don't know if he ever told anyone. His best friend, Andrew. Andrew always seemed to know when something was wrong between us. He was there for Thomas in ways that I couldn't understand. But I never thought he'd know about the vasectomy." McAllister's ears perked up at the mention of Andrew. This was the lead she had been waiting for. Detective Sarah McAllister left the interrogation room with a mix of frustration and curiosity. Claire's confession had filled in some of the gaps, but it had also raised more questions. Why had Thomas refused to tell Claire about the vasectomy, And what was the deal with his best friend, Andrew? Claire's mention of Andrew added a new layer to the case. McAllister could sense that this was the next crucial lead to explore. The next morning, she pulled up Andrew Lawson's address. He was a 42-year-old business owner who lived just a few blocks from the Whitakers. A simple enough man by all accounts. He and Thomas had been inseparable since college. From all reports, Andrew was the kind of guy who would do anything for a friend. But McAllister's gut told her that there was something more between Andrew and Thomas. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the relationship than Claire had let on. At 11 a.m., McAllister arrived at Andrew's house. It was a modest, single-story home with a well-maintained front yard, an American flag flying proudly by the front door. She knocked once, and Andrew answered almost immediately, as though he had been expecting her. "Detective McAllister?" Andrew's voice was a mix of confusion and unease, but he stepped aside to allow her in without question. He was tall, with broad shoulders, wearing a navy blue polo shirt and khaki shorts, a far cry from the heavy, set man McAllister had expected. "I know this is a difficult time, Andrew, but I need to ask you a few questions about Thomas," McAllister began, her tone firm but kind. "Of course," Andrew said, nodding solemnly. "Anything I can do to help." They sat down at the small kitchen table, the room smelling faintly of coffee and fresh pastries. McAllister got straight to the point. "Claire told me that Thomas had a vasectomy before they met. Is that true? Did you know about it?" she asked, watching Andrew closely. Andrew's face tightened for a split second, a flash of something McAllister couldn't quite identify passing over his features. But he quickly recovered, setting his coffee cup down with a steady hand. "Yeah, I knew. Thomas had it done after his first marriage ended," Andrew replied matter-of-factly. "He wasn't looking to have kids, and that was that. He never wanted to talk about it much, but I knew about it." McAllister studied Andrew's face carefully, noting the slight hesitation in his words. He wasn't lying, but there was something about his tone that seemed rehearsed, like he had said those words many times before. "I understand, but why wouldn't Thomas tell Claire?" McAllister pressed, her gaze never leaving his. Andrew shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I don't know. Thomas was always very private about certain things, his past especially. He never wanted anyone to feel like they weren't enough, you know? He probably thought it was better that Claire didn't know. They were happy. At least, I thought they were." There it was again, another mention of Thomas being private. The more Andrew spoke, the more McAllister felt that there was something deeper at play. "You were very close, I assume?" McAllister asked, trying a different angle. "Yeah," Andrew said with a soft chuckle. "We went way back. In college, we were inseparable. When his first marriage fell apart, I was there for him. When he met Claire, I thought it was good for him. She seemed to balance him out, you know." McAllister leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Was there ever any tension between Thomas and Claire? Anything unusual?" Andrew hesitated again, his eyes darting toward the window before meeting McAllister's gaze. "I mean, yeah, there were always small things, little things, but nothing that would have made me think something like this could happen. Thomas and Claire, they seemed like the perfect couple to everyone." McAllister sensed that Andrew was holding back, but she wasn't sure why. Was he trying to protect Thomas's memory, or was he trying to hide something about his relationship with Claire? "Did Thomas ever tell you anything about Claire's reactions to not being able to have children?" McAllister asked, her tone gentle. Andrew looked down at the table, his fingers nervously tapping the surface. I don't know. He never spoke to me about it directly. But I could tell, over the years, it bothered her. She always wanted kids. She told me that when they first met. It was something they never really talked about, though, at least not in front of me." McAllister noted the unease in Andrew's voice. This wasn't just an innocent conversation. She could tell that Andrew was holding back a great deal of information. The question was, why? "Andrew, I have to ask, were you ever more than just friends with Thomas?" McAllister's words were blunt, but the question hung in the air, charged with unspoken implications. Andrew looked at her sharply, his eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing as if he was measuring the weight of the question. "Number absolutely not," he said quickly, his voice rising. We were friends, just friends. That's it. Why would you think that? McAllister raised her eyebrows, not buying the defensive tone. I don't know, Andrew. You tell me. You were very close, and Claire seemed to think you knew a lot about Thomas's life, maybe more than she did. Andrew swallowed hard, his hand now trembling slightly on the coffee mug. Look, detective, I don't know why she'd think that, but I can tell you one thing for sure. Thomas loved Claire. He wanted things to work with her. He didn't want to lose her. Whatever you think about this situation, it wasn't like that. I can promise you that. McAllister wasn't so sure. There were too many gaps in Andrew's story. The hesitation, the defensiveness. It all pointed to something deeper. Andrew wasn't just a friend. He was a man who had been hiding something, and McAllister was determined to find out what. Back at the station, McAllister sat, down with the rest of the team. They had a lot to unpack. Claire had confessed to the murder, but her motive seemed tangled in lies, secrets, and half-truths. The vasectomy was only part of the story. What had pushed Claire over the edge? And why did Andrew seem so intent on protecting Thomas's legacy? McAllister felt that this case was not just about a wife's betrayal. There were other forces at work, forces that Claire and Andrew were both reluctant to reveal. I think we need to take a closer look at Andrew's relationship with Thomas and Claire, McAllister said, her voice steady. I don't believe he's being fully truthful. He's hiding something. As the team went over the case notes, McAllister stared at the photo of the Whitaker family, the smiling couple frozen in time. Behind their perfect lives, there was a darkness that was just beginning to surface. The days following her interview with Andrew Lawson were a blur for Detective Sarah McAllister. The evidence was slowly accumulating, but the case still felt like a puzzle, missing a crucial piece. Claire's confession, though damning, had only scratched the surface of the deeper issues at play. Andrew's behavior only deepened the mystery, and McAllister was becoming more convinced that the web of lies was more tangled than it appeared. It was time to dig deeper into Thomas Whitaker's life, to uncover any hidden relationships, secrets, or patterns that could explain why his marriage ended in such violence. McAllister decided to revisit the Whitaker household, this time with a fresh perspective. The next morning, McAllister walked into the Whitaker home, this time accompanied by forensic specialists. They had been back and forth to the house over the past few days, collecting more evidence and analyzing the crime scene. But now they were going to perform a more thorough search. McAllister needed to know everything about the Whitakers' life together. Every scrap of paper, every letter, every item in that house had the potential to reveal something new. Claire had been kept in custody for further questioning, but McAllister had no intentions of rushing to any conclusions. She could feel the weight of this case. Something about it gnawed at her, telling her that there was more here than just a domestic dispute gone wrong. Anything unusual? McAllister asked the lead forensic investigator, Detective Gabriel, who had been with her from the beginning. He had already combed through the bedroom and living room, but there was still a lot left to uncover. Gabriel, a seasoned officer with years of experience, shook his head. Nothing out of place, really. The house looks like a typical home. No signs of forced entry, no indication of a break-in. But we found something interesting in the study. A hidden drawer tucked away behind some books on the shelf. McAllister raised an eyebrow. Hidden? What was inside? Gabriel handed her a folder. These documents. McAllister opened the folder to find a series of letters, invoices, and medical records. At the top of the stack was a letter addressed to Thomas from a local fertility clinic. The letter was dated 6 months ago, and it was clear from the tone that it was a formal consultation regarding sperm storage and future fertility treatments. McAllister's heart raced as she flipped through the documents. This was a key piece of evidence. The timing was significant. 6 months ago was just after Claire had started to notice changes in Thomas's behavior. The letter revealed that Thomas had sought out options for having children, something that Claire had been desperate for. But why had he kept this from her? Why hadn't he told her that he had been exploring alternative ways to start a family? What's going on, Thomas? McAllister muttered to herself as she continued to read through the documents. There was also a payment receipt for sperm storage and a note from the fertility clinic reminding Thomas about his next appointment. It was clear that Thomas had not abandoned the idea of having children. If anything, he had been actively seeking solutions, just not in the way Claire had expected. The more McAllister thought about it, the more her theory started to shift. Claire's jealousy and rage over the vasectomy had been a trigger, but what if there was more to it? Could Thomas have been trying to hide something else from her? Was there a possibility that Claire was the one who had misunderstood the situation? Or was there something deeper going on in their marriage? McAllister's mind kept returning to Andrew, the best friend, the man who had been in Thomas's life for years, the one who knew all the details about Thomas's personal life, yet he had been evasive during their interview. He knew more than he was letting on, and McAllister was certain that the relationship between Andrew and Thomas held the answers to the growing questions. A few hours later, McAllister sat at her desk, reviewing her notes and the new evidence. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but she still wasn't sure what the picture looked like. There was a knock on the door and Officer Davis, a young but promising investigator, stepped inside. "Detective McAllister, I've got something that might help," Davis said, holding up a thick file. "We ran a background check on Andrew Lawson. There are some discrepancies in his financial records. He's been making large unaccounted-for withdrawals from his personal bank account. We also found several payments to a private investigator." McAllister's interest peaked. "A private investigator? What for?" "That's the question," Davis replied. "We don't have all the details yet, but it's clear that Andrew has been involved in something. I'm having the bank trace these transactions. It looks like he's been hiding a lot more than just his relationship with Thomas." McAllister stood up, her heart racing. "This changes everything. If Andrew's been hiding something from both Claire and Thomas, then we need to find out what. Get me the name of that investigator. We need to dig into Andrew's dealings now." That evening, McAllister drove to Andrew's business. It was a small consulting firm located in a quiet business park on the outskirts of town. When she entered, she was greeted by the receptionist, a friendly woman who looked surprised to see McAllister. "Detective McAllister," the receptionist said, "can I help you?" "I need to speak to Mr. Lawson," McAllister said firmly. "I've come to discuss some recent developments." The receptionist hesitated but nodded. "I'll let him know you're here." Minutes later, Andrew appeared in the doorway, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a tense unease. "Detective, I wasn't expecting you. Is something wrong?" McAllister wasted no time. "I know about the private investigator, Andrew. I know about the money transfers. It's time to tell me everything." Andrew's face went white as a sheet. His attempt to remain composed was faltering. He glanced toward the receptionist, who had already retreated to the back office. "Look, detective," he began, his voice shaking. "It's not what you think. I was just trying to help my friend. Thomas didn't want to tell Claire the truth, but he needed help. I was just doing what I could to protect him." "Protect him from what?" McAllister pressed, taking a step closer. "What were you trying to protect him from, Andrew?" Andrew swallowed hard. For a moment, McAllister thought he might crack, but instead he took a deep breath and said, "Thomas was having an affair." McAllister's heart skipped a beat. This was new information. Who was he having the affair with? Andrew hesitated. "I can't say, but Claire was starting to figure it out. I was trying to get him to come clean to her before she found out on her own." Everything clicked into place. The affair, the fertility treatments, the hidden payments. It was all part of a complicated, tangled web of secrets that Thomas had been trying to keep hidden from Claire. And now McAllister was closer than ever to understanding the truth behind the murder. As McAllister left Andrew's office, her mind raced. There was still so much to uncover, but she now had the key to understanding the relationship between Claire, Thomas, and Andrew. The truth was finally coming to light, and it was darker than anyone could have imagined. The truth was becoming clearer, yet it felt more tangled than ever. Detective Sarah McAllister had just learned that Thomas Whitaker had been having an affair, one that no one had suspected. The pieces of the puzzle were fitting together, but the full picture still eluded her. How far had Thomas gone to protect his secrets? What was the true reason behind his deadly encounter with Claire? And most importantly, what role had Andrew Lawson played in all of this? It was late evening when McAllister left Andrew's office, the weight of her findings settling heavily on her shoulders. She had more questions than answers, but now she had a clearer understanding of the dynamics between Thomas, Claire, and Andrew. Each of them had been hiding something, and it was becoming increasingly clear that the marriage had been fractured long before that fateful night. Back at the station, McAllister gathered her team for a briefing. She went over everything they had uncovered so far: Claire's confession, the vasectomy, the fertility treatments, Andrew's financial transactions, and the affair. It was a web of lies, but there was still one crucial piece missing. Who was Thomas's lover? "All right, we're missing the most important detail here," McAllister said, addressing the Amir group. "We know Thomas was having an affair, and we know Andrew was helping him cover it up, but we don't know who the woman was. That's our next step. If we can find her, we'll have the whole story." Officer Davis nodded. "I'll run the list of women who may have been involved. We can cross-check Thomas's personal contacts, social media activity, and any records of hotels or restaurants he frequented. There's got to be something." "Good," McAllister said. "Meanwhile, I want a deeper dive into Andrew's background. If he was involved in Thomas's affair, we need to understand the full extent of his involvement. I'm not buying that he was just trying to protect his friend." The team dispersed and McAllister remained seated at her desk, her fingers tapping restlessly on the surface. She was getting closer to the truth, but she could feel the case slipping from her grasp, like sand running through her fingers. It was time for a different approach. She picked up the phone and called Claire, requesting another round of questioning. 2 hours later, Claire was sitting across from McAllister once again, but this time, the woman who had once appeared so fragile seemed a little more composed. Her eyes no longer showed the wild panic they had the night of the arrest. There was a calmness now, a resignation, as if Claire had come to terms with the mess her life had become. "Claire, I've spoken to Andrew," McAllister began, her voice measured, "and I've learned a lot about your marriage, about Thomas's secret life, about the affair." Claire's face drained of color as she stiffened, her hands gripping the edge of the table. I don't know what you mean," she stammered, but her voice had lost its conviction. "You knew, didn't you?" McAllister asked, leaning forward slightly. "You had suspicions. That's why you were so angry with Thomas, right? Because you were starting to figure it out." Claire was silent for a long moment, her eyes downcast. The silence stretched, heavy and thick, until finally she spoke. "Yes, I knew," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I didn't want to believe it, but I knew." McAllister nodded, the pieces falling into place. Claire had been hiding her suspicions all along, and her growing frustration had led to explosive arguments between the couple. It was the perfect storm: Thomas's betrayal, his vasectomy, his refusal to talk about the future. And in Claire's eyes, the last straw had been his unwillingness to give her the family she so desperately wanted. "What happened the night of the murder, Claire?" McAllister asked softly, watching her every reaction. "Tell me exactly what went down." Claire took a shaky breath, her face contorted with emotion, and for the first time since McAllister had met her, there was no mask, no facade. This was the raw, broken woman who had been betrayed, who had been pushed to the edge by a series of devastating revelations. "I found out about the affair that night," Claire said, her voice cracking. I found his phone. He was too careless. He left it on the counter, unlocked. I saw the messages, everything. She was younger than me, of course, and they'd been seeing each other for months." Claire's eyes filled with tears, but she wiped them away quickly, as if angry with herself for showing weakness. McAllister could see the pain in her face, the betrayal, the loss, the grief. But underneath that, there was something darker, something harder to decipher. "I confronted him," Claire continued. "I screamed at him. I told him he had ruined everything. I couldn't bear the thought that he had lied to me for all those years. And then I found out about the vasectomy. He had done it before we met, and he never told me. I thought I was going to die inside. I thought I would never forgive him." Her voice faltered, but she pressed on. "And then I snapped. He said it didn't matter, that it was too late for us to have kids anyway. And I just couldn't take it. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think straight. I felt like everything was falling apart, like my entire life had been a lie." McAllister stayed silent, letting Claire's words settle. It was clear now that the murder had been driven by more than just anger. It was a culmination of years of unmet needs, lies, and betrayals. Claire had been desperate to have children, to save a marriage that had already been crumbling, and when she found out the truth, it was too much for her to handle. "I didn't mean to kill him," Claire whispered, her voice breaking. "I just wanted him to stop lying. I didn't think it would go that far. But when I grabbed the knife, it was like I couldn't stop myself." McAllister felt a pang of sympathy, but she also knew that this confession wouldn't absolve Claire of the consequences of her actions. The law was clear. Murder was murder, no matter how deep the emotional wounds. Later that evening, McAllister sat alone in her office, replaying Claire's confession in her mind. It was clear that Claire, devastated by Thomas's lies, but there was still something nagging at McAllister. What had Andrew's role been in all of this? Had he known Claire would eventually find out? Had he manipulated Thomas, pushing him further into secrecy? As McAllister looked over the case files once more, she received an unexpected call from Officer Davis. "Detective, we've got a lead on Thomas's mistress," he said. "We tracked her down. Her name is Emily Carter, and she works as a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital. We've got her address. We need to bring her in for questioning." McAllister's heart raced. The missing link, the final piece of the puzzle, was within her reach. The rain had started falling heavily, tapping against the windows of Detective Sarah McAllister's office as the storm raged outside. The night felt colder than it had in weeks, a fitting atmosphere for what McAllister knew was about to unfold. The case of Thomas Whitaker's murder had been a tumultuous journey, filled with twists, lies, and unexpected turns. But now, with the identification of Emily Carter as Thomas's mistress, McAllister felt the weight of the investigation settle on her shoulders. She was about to bring it all to a close. The final piece was within her grasp. McAllister arrived at Emily Carter's address just after midnight. The small house was nestled on the outskirts of the city, a modest structure with a neatly kept lawn and a faint light shining through the curtains. The police team was already in position, and McAllister felt her heart beat faster with each step she took toward the front door. This was the moment she had been waiting for. As McAllister knocked on the door, she could hear the shuffle of footsteps inside. The door opened slightly and Emily Carter stood before her, a woman in her late 20s with a tired expression. She looked like someone who had been up all night, perhaps expecting this moment, perhaps not. "Ms. Carter," McAllister began, her voice firm but not unkind. "I'm Detective Sarah McAllister. I'm afraid we need to speak with you regarding the murder of Thomas Whitaker." Emily's eyes widened, and she instinctively stepped back, her hands gripping the doorframe. Her voice trembled. I don't know anything about a murder. I don't even know who you're talking about." McAllister kept her calm. "I think you do, Emily. I know about the affair you had with Thomas. I know you two were involved for months, and I know you were one of the last people to see him before he died. We need to talk about what happened that night." There was a long pause as Emily stood there, her eyes darting back and forth as if weighing her options. Finally, she sighed deeply and nodded, stepping aside to let McAllister into the house. "Come in," Emily said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll tell you what you want to know." Inside, the house was small but well kept. The air was thick with a sense of unease, and McAllister could feel the tension in the room as Emily led her to a small sitting area. Emily sat down on the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap, avoiding eye contact. "I don't know where to start," Emily murmured, her voice shaking slightly. "You can start by telling me everything about your relationship with Thomas," McAllister said, taking a seat across from her. "How did it begin? Why did it happen?" Emily hesitated, her eyes welling with tears. "It started about a year ago. I met Thomas at the hospital where I work. He was one of the regular patients, and we started talking. At first, it was just friendly conversations. But then, we started spending more time together. I didn't think much of it at first. He was married, and I never imagined that anything would come of it. But then it did." McAllister watched her closely, noting the mix of guilt and sadness in Emily's expression. "And when did things become serious?" Emily swallowed hard. "After a few months, he started telling me about his wife, Claire. He said their marriage was falling apart. He said Claire was obsessed with having children and that she didn't understand why they couldn't have kids. He told me that he had a vasectomy years ago, before they met, and that Claire had no idea. He said it was a secret he'd kept from her for years, and that it was destroying their marriage. McAllister nodded, her mind racing. The pieces of Thomas's life were falling into place. His affair with Emily was not just a betrayal, it was part of a pattern of lies he had told, a secret he had kept hidden for far too long. "But why didn't you just end it, Emily?" McAllister pressed. "Why continue the affair if you knew it was wrong?" "I didn't want to get involved at first," Emily confessed, her voice trembling. "But then, he started to talk about leaving Claire. He said he was done with the marriage. He said he wanted to be with me, that we could start fresh. I didn't want to believe it, but I wanted to believe him. I thought we could have a future together." McAllister leaned forward. "But that didn't happen, did it?" Emily's lip quivered. "Number?" He started pulling away. It was like he was torn between me and Claire. He'd make promises, but then he'd get distant. I knew something wasn't right, but I didn't push him too much. I was afraid of losing him. McAllister took a deep breath, trying to piece together the timeline. "Where were you the night Thomas was murdered?" I was at home," Emily said, her voice breaking. "I didn't see him that night. He didn't show up like he said he would. I I didn't know anything was wrong until the next morning when I saw it on the news." McAllister studied her carefully, looking for any sign of deception, but all she saw was genuine confusion and sorrow. It was clear that Emily had no direct involvement in Thomas's death, but her presence in his life had set in motion the tragic events that led to that fatal night. "Do you know anything about Thomas's vasectomy?" McAllister asked. "Did he ever talk about it with you?" Emily nodded slowly. "Yes, he told me about it. He said he had it done years ago, before he met Claire. He said Claire had no idea, and that's why their marriage was falling apart. I didn't think it was that big of a deal, but I guess it was to her." McAllister felt a cold rush of realization. Emily's story corroborated everything Claire had said. Thomas's vasectomy had been a point of contention in his marriage. It had been the one thing Claire couldn't forgive, the thing that pushed her to the brink. And when Claire found out about the affair, it was the final straw. The result had been catastrophic. McAllister left Emily's house with a heavy heart. The final pieces of the puzzle were in place. The affair, the vasectomy, the secrets, the lies, all of it had led to that tragic moment when Claire snapped. She had found out everything that night, the affair, the vasectomy, and in her grief and anger, she had taken matters into her own hands. But even with all the pieces now on the table, McAllister knew that Claire's actions were inexcusable. Murder was still murder, no matter the circumstances. The emotional trauma Claire had suffered did not absolve her from the consequences of her actions. In the weeks that followed, the trial for Thomas Whitaker's murder began. Claire stood before the court, her eyes filled with sorrow and regret. She pled guilty to the charge of manslaughter, and while her defense tried to paint her as a woman driven to madness by betrayal, the jury found her responsible for the crime. In the end, Claire was sentenced to 12 years in prison for the death of her husband, Thomas. It was a sentence that felt neither too harsh nor too lenient, just a tragic end to a life filled with lies, secrets, and unfulfilled dreams. McAllister watched the proceedings from the back of the courtroom. Knowing that justice had been served, but still feeling the weight of the case, she had uncovered the truth, but it was a truth that left her with no sense of triumph, only a deep, abiding sadness for everyone involved. As she left the courthouse, the rain had stopped and the sky had cleared. The storm had passed, but the damage was done. Some storms, McAllister knew, never fully pass. They leave a trail of destruction behind them, one that can never truly be repaired. And so she walked away, carrying the weight of the case with her, knowing that the final truth had been revealed. But there would be no celebration, no relief, only the quiet knowledge that sometimes the truth is the hardest thing to bear.